I analyze data for a living. I spend my days looking for the microscopic errors that prove a massive system is fundamentally broken. Numbers are objective. They do not hallucinate. They do not lie. And they do not slowly lose their minds. For the last 3 weeks, I've been trying to convince myself that I am losing mine. My wife and I live in a heavily wooded suburb at the end of a dead cul-de-sac. Our home used to be a sanctuary of predictable routines and heavy, insulating quiet. I knew the specific ambient noises of our life together. I knew the low, mechanical hum of the refrigerator compressor clicking on at midnight. I knew the exact rhythmic cadence of my wife walking across the hardwood floor in her bare feet. I knew her. I knew the microscopic muscles around her eyes that would contract when she found something genuinely funny. But 21 days ago, the data started to corrupt. It began with fractions of a second. Tiny, disjointed moments of incorrect anatomy that my rational brain violently rejected. I would look up from my laptop in the evening and catch her staring at me from the kitchen island. She would be smiling, but the expression was entirely localized to the bottom half of her face. Her eyes were completely dead. Just 2 flat, glossy discs staring directly through my forehead. When I asked her if she was feeling all right, she would blink hard. The warmth would instantly flood back into her face like a digital reset. She would laugh it off and blame the exhaustion of her corporate job. I wanted to believe her. But the anomalies continued to escalate. Her posture started shifting when she thought she was alone in a room. I walked past the laundry room one afternoon and saw her standing by the washing machine. Her spine was rigidly straight, but her neck was craned forward at a sharp, physically agonizing angle. Then I noticed the blinking. I timed it one night while pretending to read a book on the couch. Every 4 seconds, exactly. Snap shut, snap open. Like a biological metronome ticking away inside her skull. I convinced myself I was suffering from severe burnout. I am a deeply rational man. I believe in carbon monoxide leaks, acute stress responses, and early onset neurological decay. I do not believe in the paranormal. I scheduled a private MRI for myself, quietly terrified that I was developing schizophrenia. Then last Thursday evening, shattered that theory entirely. A heavy thunderstorm had rolled in, drumming a steady, aggressive rhythm against the glass of the living room windows. I was sitting on the couch, listening to the comforting sound of my wife making dinner in the kitchen. She was humming a song under her breath. It was not a recognizable tune, just a low, repetitive, droning melody that seemed to vibrate directly in my teeth. I stood up and walked down the short hallway to ask her a question. I stopped dead in the doorway. She was not cooking. She was standing in the darkest corner of the kitchen, facing the blank drywall right next to the pantry door. She was just standing inches from the paint, staring straight ahead, continuing to hum that low, vibrating note. The air in the room felt incredibly dense. It carried the faint, suffocating smell of damp earth and rotting copper. I opened my mouth to call her name before I could make a sound. My phone violently vibrated in my pocket. I pulled it out and stared at the glowing screen in the dim light. The caller ID said it was her. My thumb hovered over the screen, trembling slightly as I pressed accept and lifted the speaker to my ear. Her voice came through the receiver immediately, accompanied by the unmistakable sound of windshield wipers and passing traffic. She sighed heavily, telling me she was stuck in massive gridlock on the interstate and would not be home for at least 40 minutes. I stood frozen in the kitchen doorway. I was listening to my wife complaining about the rain directly into my ear. The woman standing inches from the pantry wall slowly stopped humming. She did not turn around. A wave of absolute nausea hit the back of my throat. I backed out of the kitchen without making a single sound. I locked myself inside the master bedroom and sat in the dark until I heard the heavy front door open 40 minutes later. When the real version of her walked in, soaking wet and apologizing for the delay, I simply hugged her. I checked the kitchen, finding it completely empty. The metallic taste of pure panic flooded my mouth. I convinced myself it was a massive auditory and visual hallucination, a symptom of a breaking brain. I swallowed 2 heavy sleeping pills that night. I was desperate to force my nervous system to shut down and reboot. The medication dragged me into a thick, dreamless sleep. It worked perfectly until exactly 2 a.m. I woke up suddenly. I was gasping for air with a painfully dry mouth and a heavy, groggy haze clouding my vision. The storm had passed. The house was suffocatingly quiet. The kind of absolute silence that makes your eardrums physically ache and ring. I sat up slowly on the edge of the mattress to go get a glass of water from the bathroom. I looked out the open bedroom door and down the pitch-black hallway. It was illuminated only by a single sliver of pale, yellow street light cutting through the front window blinds. I stopped breathing. She was standing at the very end of the long hallway. She was perfectly still, facing my direction. Only the left half of her face was caught in the thin slice of street light. Her eye was locked dead onto me. It was completely unblinking and stretched open unnaturally wide. The temperature in the bedroom seemed to instantly plummet. A freezing, damp chill sank directly into my bones. It made my breath visible in the dark room. I swallowed hard. I whispered her name into the blackness. She did not move a single muscle. I kept my eyes locked on the terrifying shape at the end of the hall. I slowly reached my left hand backward onto the mattress behind me. I was feeling around in the dark for my phone to turn on the camera flashlight. My fingers brushed against the thick down comforter. I reached further back. My hand touched a warm shoulder. It was moving up and down in a steady, rhythmic motion. I froze completely. I slowly traced the shape lying in the bed right beside me. It was her, sleeping deeply and soundly under the blankets. The crushing silence in the room became incredibly heavy. I looked back down the dark hallway. The figure standing in the pale light slowly lifted its long arm. It raised a single, elongated, multi-jointed finger and pressed it against its lips. I did not scream. Screaming requires oxygen, and the heavy, dead air in the bedroom felt like thick water filling my lungs. I slowly pulled my hand back from the warm shoulder of the woman sleeping beside me. I kept my eyes locked on the pitch-black hallway. The entity standing in the thin slice of street light did not lower its elongated finger from its pale lips. It did not walk away. It simply dissolved backward into the heavy shadows of the house. It was like watching thick oil recede into the floorboards. I laid back down against the mattress, inch by agonizing inch. I pulled the heavy comforter up over my chest. I closed my eyes and listened to the deafening, wet thud of my own heart hammering against my ribs. I stayed perfectly still for 6 straight hours in the dark. I listened to the massive structure of the house settle around me. Every subtle groan of the floorboards sounded like a heavy footstep approaching the bedroom door. My throat was completely parched. My tongue felt swollen and coated in dry sand. When the gray light of morning finally filtered through the blinds, my wife stirred. She stretched her arms, kissed me softly on the cheek, and walked down the hall to start the coffee maker. I watched her back as she left the room. My jaw was clenched so tightly that my molars physically ached. I forced myself to get out of bed. My legs felt like heavy lead weights. I walked into the kitchen and sat at the island. The smell of dark roast coffee filled the room. It was a deeply normal, comforting smell. It felt like a sick joke. She poured 2 mugs and asked me how I slept. Her voice sounded perfectly flat, devoid of any morning grogginess. I smiled back at her. My facial muscles felt stiff and mechanical, like I was pulling rusted levers just to mimic a human emotion. I told her I slept fine. I was entirely isolated inside my own skull. The kitchen felt like a pressurized cabin slowly losing oxygen. Every time she turned her back to the stove, I searched the back of her neck, looking for a seam, looking for proof of the anomaly. Once she backed her car out of the driveway for work, I put my plan into motion. I drove to an electronics supplier 3 towns over to ensure I would not run into anyone we knew. I bought a closed-circuit infrared security system. I intentionally avoided anything with a wireless internet connection. I did not want cloud storage. I did not want compression algorithms or digital artifacts that could be explained away as a glitch. I needed raw, hard, unalterable data. I drove back to the empty house. The quiet inside the walls felt oppressive and completely hollow. It felt like walking into a massive, soundproof tomb. I spent 6 hours running black coaxial cables behind the drywall. The dry dust from the plaster coated my hands and settled deep in my throat, making me cough violently into the dead silence. I felt like an intruder committing a shameful crime in my own home. I mounted the first micro lens inside the plastic casing of the living room smoke detector. I placed the second behind the metal slats of the air return grate in the long hallway. The final camera was the absolute hardest to install. I dragged a heavy wooden step stool into the master bedroom. I stood directly over the mattress where we sleep. I unscrewed the metal ceiling vent directly above our pillows. My hands were trembling so violently I dropped the heavy steel screwdriver. The metal clattered against the hardwood floor. The sharp noise cracked through the quiet room like a gunshot. I swallowed the metallic taste of pure adrenaline pooling in the back of my mouth. I pushed the tiny black lens deep into the shadows of the ductwork. I angled the curved glass down to capture a direct aerial view of our bed. It covered the entire mattress. It covered the floor. It covered the dark, narrow 6-inch gap beneath the wooden bed frame. When she came home that evening, I blamed my quiet demeanor on a looming data audit at work. We ate dinner in relative silence. The sun went down. The house began its nightly routine of subtle creaks and settling wood. We got into bed at 10 o'clock. She fell asleep in minutes. I did not. I lay flat on my back. I was absolutely terrified to close my eyes. Every microscopic sound was violently magnified inside my head. The house was dead quiet, except for the slow dragging friction of the pine branches scraping against the vinyl siding outside. My pulse was thudding so hard against my eardrums that I felt physically motion sick. The ambient temperature in the room felt freezing. Yet I was sweating heavily through my cotton shirt. I was hyperventilating quietly through my nose, desperate to not wake her. The mattress shifted slightly every time she breathed in. I spent 8 agonizing hours praying to a God I do not believe in. I prayed that my brain was fundamentally broken. I prayed for a massive tumor in my frontal lobe. I prayed for insanity. Morning finally arrived. She left for the office at exactly 8:15. I watched her car disappear down the street through the front blinds. I locked the front door. I threw the heavy metal deadbolt. I walked down the hall to my home office. I shut the solid wood door and locked that too. I sat down at my desk. The air in the little room felt thick and incredibly stale. I plugged the encrypted hard drive into my laptop port. The security software booted up. The green-tinted infrared footage populated on my screen in 3 neat squares. I started with the living room. I set the playback speed to double time. Empty. Just 8 uninterrupted hours of static. Gray stillness. I clicked over to the hallway feed. Nothing. The deep, suffocating pressure in my chest actually started to loosen. The data was proving me wrong. I was safe. I opened the massive video file for the master bedroom. I watched the digital timestamp in the bottom right corner click forward. Midnight, 1 in the morning, 2 in the morning. I watched the green-tinted shapes of my wife and I sleeping. We did not move. My shoulders dropped entirely. I let my heavy head fall forward into my trembling hands. I wept silently into my palms out of pure, overwhelming relief. I was just sick. I could get a prescription. I could fix this. I wiped the tears from my burning eyes. I looked back up at the glowing monitor. The green numbers in the corner shifted. 0316, 0317. The low ambient static of the room audio abruptly cut out over my desktop speakers. Absolute dead silence filled the office. The motion on the screen stopped being normal, agonizingly slowly. From the pitch-black narrow gap beneath the bed frame, something began to emerge. A long, impossibly pale hand slid silently out from the darkness under my wife's side of the mattress. It was not human. The fingers were deeply elongated. They possessed entirely too many joints. I stopped breathing. My chest seized violently. I watched the impossibly long digits reach upward. They bent backward at sickening, snapping angles. They curled tightly around the very edge of the mattress. I did not hit pause. I could not make my heavy finger click the plastic mouse button. My body was locked rigidly into the leather office chair. I was entirely paralyzed by the absolute destruction of my reality unfolding on the green-tinted monitor. The digital numbers in the bottom right corner of the screen ticked forward. 0318. The impossibly long, pale fingers gripping the edge of the mattress began to slowly pull upward. The entity did not crawl out from the narrow gap beneath the heavy oak bed frame. It unspooled. It moved with a disjointed, liquid fluidity that deeply violated all laws of basic biology. It looked like thick, heavy mass being poured upward against gravity. First, a bone-white arm emerged from the pitch-black darkness. The elbow joint bent completely backward, popping loudly through the small desktop speakers. It was a wet, sickening crunch, like raw meat tearing away from thick cartilage. Then came the torso. The rib cage was deeply sunken, pulling the translucent skin incredibly tight across its hollow chest. It dragged its long body over the hardwood floor, completely silent, entirely devoid of any natural friction. The head slid out into the harsh infrared light last. I violently pressed my trembling palm flat against my own mouth to suppress the guttural noise tearing up my throat. The metallic smell of blood mixed with the stale, suffocating dust of the room as my nails dug deep into my cheeks. It was her. It was a flawless, terrifying biological replica of the woman I married. But the skeletal structure beneath the artificial face was fundamentally broken. The jaw hung exactly 2 inches too low. It left the mouth perpetually open in a slack, hollow gasp. Its dark eyes were massive, consuming the upper half of its face, completely devoid of any white sclera. The entity dragged its lower half out from the darkness. Its hips bent completely backward. Its legs twisted violently against the floorboards before snapping into place with a heavy, dull thud. It stood up directly beside the mattress. It was easily 7 feet tall. Its incredibly long arms dangled loosely at its sides. The elongated fingers brushed the wood floor with every microscopic movement. It did not attack us. It did not violently tear into the heavy blankets covering our sleeping bodies. It simply stepped backward into the absolute darkest corner of the bedroom. And it stopped moving entirely. The digital timestamp ticked past 3:30. 4 in the morning, 5 in the morning. The creature stood perfectly still for hours. It was a towering, gray monolith of paralyzing silence. Its elongated neck was craned sharply forward, angling its massive black eyes directly down at my sleeping wife. It was relentlessly studying her. The highly sensitive audio feed picked up the slow, steady sound of my wife breathing in her deep sleep. Then, from the hunched shadow looming over her, a second set of breaths began. The mimic started out jagged and raspy, like dry winter air being pushed through a rusted metal pipe. But slowly, methodically, it adjusted its own mechanical throat. I watched its hollow chest expand and contract. It was meticulously synchronizing its own breathing pattern to match the exact depth and cadence of her lungs. When she rolled over in her sleep, the creature slightly shifted its own massive weight. It was practicing her subtle kinetic movements. It was downloading her micro-expressions. It was memorizing the data to perfectly hijack its host without triggering an alarm. The air in my office suddenly felt incredibly thin. I was suffocating on my own recycled breath. My vision was tunneling into a tiny pinpoint of dark gray static around the glowing monitor. The digital clock in the corner of the screen hit 5:58. The video feed caught the entity turning its head sharply toward the digital alarm clock on the nightstand, 2 minutes before the loud electronic alarm was set to go off. The creature's spine violently contorted. It folded itself entirely in half backwards, its flat skull touching its pale heels. It silently slithered backward into the pitch-black abyss beneath the bed frame. The narrow space swallowed the massive creature entirely in less than a second. The video feed caught the alarm ringing exactly 2 minutes later. I watched myself reach over and slam my hand onto the plastic snooze button. I watched the recorded version of myself groan and get out of bed. I was completely unaware of the massive anomaly resting mere inches beneath my bare feet. The recorded video file ended. The media player abruptly closed. The bright default desktop background stared back at me in mocking silence. The heavy, crushing reality slammed into my chest like a physical cement block. It did not leave the room. It did not escape out a window or retreat back to a dark crawl space. It was currently under the mattress. Right now, in the exact room she was still in. A violent jolt of pure, freezing adrenaline hit my central nervous system. My hand flew to the computer mouse. I frantically clicked on the security icon to open the live application feed. I didn't care about the empty living room. I did not care about the dark hallway. I opened the master bedroom camera in full screen. The room was bathed in the harsh, flat, gray light of the infrared daytime filter. She was starting to wake up. I watched her body shifting under the heavy white comforter. She slowly pushed the thick blankets down to her waist. She turned her body to sit up on the very edge of the mattress. Her bare feet dangled just an inch above the hardwood floor. She reached her arms high over her head to stretch her back. I leaned violently forward into the glowing monitor until my nose almost touched the glass. The dark space beneath the bed frame was perfectly still. Then the pitch-black shadow rapidly shifted. The physical motion was impossibly fast. A single, pale, multi-jointed hand shot completely silently out from the dark gap. Its long, gray fingers wrapped violently around her bare, dangling ankle. The live feed abruptly cut to a massive wall of deafening static. The violent burst of digital static on my monitor severed the live feed. It was replaced by a deafening, hissing white noise that physically vibrated my teeth. I sat completely frozen in the leather office chair. The sheer volume of the terror flooding my nervous system completely bypassed my conscious thought. I was operating entirely on raw, primal survival instinct. I shoved the heavy chair backward. It scraped violently against the hardwood floor, echoing loudly down the quiet hallway. I walked toward the closed office door. Every single logical, deeply ingrained human instinct screamed at me to run out the front door and never look back. But I knew exactly what was in that bedroom. I knew it was highly aggressive, and I knew it had its elongated fingers wrapped directly around her ankle. I had to suppress every microscopic trace of the paralyzing fear coursing through my veins. If I walked into that bedroom projecting terror, if I gave the mimic any indication that its ambush was compromised, it would completely slaughter us both before I could even cross the threshold. I had to perfectly manipulate the variables. I had to engineer a flawless, unassailable alibi for an immediate extraction. I took one incredibly deep breath of stale, dusty air into my burning lungs. I threw the office door open and sprinted heavily down the narrow hallway. I burst into the master bedroom. My chest was heaving with violently manufactured panic. I forced my eyes to stay rigidly locked onto the upper half of her body. I absolutely refused to look down at the dark, narrow 6-inch gap beneath the heavy bed frame. She was sitting frozen on the very edge of the mattress. Her dark eyes were wide and frantic, locked directly onto mine. She looked totally baffled. It was a flawless, perfect imitation of a deeply groggy, confused wife startled awake. I screamed my desperate lie at the absolute top of my lungs. I told her my phone just received a critical priority alert from the smart home environmental sensor. I told her the digital basement monitor detected a catastrophic carbon monoxide leak from the furnace. I injected pure, hysterical chaos into the quiet bedroom. I yelled that we were breathing heavy, invisible toxins and had less than 2 minutes before we died. I lunged forward across the carpet. I grabbed her forcefully by the upper arm. Her bare skin felt impossibly freezing, like holding onto a block of damp, porous ice. I violently yanked her off the mattress. She stumbled forward into my chest, pretending to lose her balance. She demanded to know what was happening. Her voice thick with perfectly manufactured sleepiness. She said she needed to crouch down and look under the bed frame for her sneakers. I screamed no. I pulled her roughly away from the darkness. I told her the dense gas was pooling near the floorboards, and there was absolutely no time for shoes. I practically dragged her heavy, rigid body out of the room and down the long hallway. I threw open the heavy oak front door and shoved her out onto the wet concrete of the driveway. The freezing morning rain hit my face like thousands of tiny needles. I shoved her forcefully into the passenger seat of her own car and slammed the metal door shut. I scrambled around the hood of the vehicle, jumped into the driver's seat, and violently jammed the metal key into the ignition. The engine roared to life. I threw the transmission into reverse and stomped the heavy gas pedal flat to the floor mat. The tires violently spun out, throwing wet gravel completely across the manicured lawn. I slammed the brakes, threw the car into drive, and sped down the empty suburban street. The claustrophobia inside the small metal cabin was utterly suffocating. I engaged the central locking system, trapping us inside the moving box. The only sound in the car was the aggressive, rhythmic slapping of the rubber windshield wipers tearing through the heavy downpour. I gripped the leather steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles turned completely white. We were moving at 70 miles an hour. I kept rapidly checking my peripheral vision. Every time I glanced over, she was shivering slightly in the passenger seat. She hugged her bare knees tightly to her chest. She looked entirely vulnerable, entirely human. She kept softly asking me if I felt dizzy, if the toxins had already damaged my lungs. I ground my back molars together and told her I was fine. We drove silently for 30 agonizing miles away from our neighborhood. I finally saw the massive glowing neon sign of a cheap, concrete roadside motel. I yanked the steering wheel hard, pulling the car roughly into the cracked asphalt parking lot. I killed the engine. The aggressive slapping of the wipers abruptly stopped. I told her to stay perfectly still while I went into the fluorescent-lit lobby to rent a room. I left her alone in the cold car, quietly terrified that the entity would completely vanish before I returned. I paid cash to the bored teenager behind the thick bulletproof glass. I grabbed the heavy brass key and sprinted back through the pouring rain. She was still sitting in the passenger seat, exactly where I left her. We ran up the concrete stairs to room number 24. I shoved the heavy metal door open and pulled her inside. The cheap room smelled violently of harsh chemical bleach and stale tobacco smoke. I slammed the heavy door shut behind us. I threw the thick deadbolt. I slid the heavy metal security chain perfectly into the track. I collapsed backward against the cheap mattress. My spine loudly cracked as I exhaled a massive, shuddering breath. The crushing pressure inside my ribs finally began to shatter. I did it. I successfully outsmarted an apex predator. I forcefully extracted my wife from a guaranteed slaughter. She stood in the middle of the cheap carpet, staring blankly at the ugly, floral wallpaper. She softly whispered that her face felt incredibly numb from the cold wind. She said she needed to splash freezing water into her eyes to clear the lingering carbon monoxide. She slowly walked into the tiny motel bathroom. She pulled the thin wooden door mostly shut behind her, leaving it cracked open only an inch. I heard the rusty metal sink faucet loudly squeal open. The harsh sound of rushing water echoed sharply against the cheap tile. I closed my eyes, finally allowing my heavy muscles to sink deep into the mattress. Instantly, my cell phone violently buzzed against my thigh. The aggressive vibration sent a terrible electric shock directly up my spine. I blindly reached into my wet pocket and pulled out the glowing screen. It was a priority notification banner from the offline security application. The interior hallway camera at the house just detected a massive burst of physical motion. A sickening feeling of absolute dread immediately flooded my entire body. I stared at the glowing phone screen in the dim motel room. I assumed it was the massive, disjointed creature, furious at being tricked, aggressively tearing through the empty drywall of my home looking for us. My trembling thumb heavily pressed the notification button to open the live video feed. The digital loading wheel on the black screen spun agonizingly slowly. The harsh chemical smell of bleach burned the back of my dry throat. The encrypted application bypassed the local firewall back at my house. The green-tinted infrared feed from the master bedroom filled the glass screen. I braced my nervous system to witness the violently destroyed drywall of an empty room. I did not see a monster. I saw a human being. A woman was standing perfectly still in the harsh green light. She was wearing the exact same oversized cotton sleep shirt my wife wore to bed every single night. My rational brain violently rejected the visual data pouring into my eyes. The heavy lead weight of absolute confusion pressed deep into the base of my skull. My vision began to tunnel into a tight circle of gray static. I brought the glowing phone screen an inch from my face. The woman on the screen slowly looked up directly into the tiny camera lens. It was her. It was my actual wife. Her face was entirely covered in dark, heavy bruising around her cheekbones and jawline. Her bottom lip was split completely open. I watched thick, dark blood dripping steadily from her chin onto the white collar of her shirt. She looked utterly terrified, her chest violently heaving with crushing panic. I watched her raise her trembling hands toward the ceiling lens. Her knuckles were raw and shredded down to the stark white bone. She turned and threw her entire body weight against the heavy oak wood of our locked bedroom door. She was silently screaming, sobbing hysterically as she frantically pounded her bloody fists against the inside of the door frame. She was begging the empty room to be let out. The soul-crushing truth slammed into my central nervous system like a massive physical blow. The blood completely drained from my face, leaving my skin as freezing and numb as dead meat. The metallic taste of pure adrenaline and raw horror flooded the back of my mouth. The anomaly did not just grab her ankle this morning. It ambushed her the very second the live feed cut to static. It forcefully dragged her deep into the pitch-black abyss beneath the heavy bed frame. It completely hijacked her physical space. It flawlessly swapped places with her seconds before I burst through the bedroom door, screaming my desperate lie. I did not rescue the woman I love. I willingly extracted a parasitic apex predator from its hidden nest. I locked my terrified, bleeding wife inside the suffocating walls of our empty home. I dragged a nightmare into my passenger seat and drove it 30 miles away to an isolated concrete box. I voluntarily delivered myself to the absolute, perfect slaughter. The tiny phone speaker in my trembling palm suddenly crackled to life. The raw audio feed from my house connected over the weak cellular signal. The high-pitched, hysterical wailing of my true wife echoed terribly into the quiet motel room. The sickening sound of her wet, bloody knuckles violently hammering against the heavy oak door filled the dead air. At that exact second, the rushing water in the tiny motel bathroom abruptly shut off. The squealing metal pipes groaned heavily and went completely dead. A thick, suffocating silence aggressively descended over the cheap room. The only sound left in the entire world was the tiny, metallic sobbing of my real wife, pleading for her life. My lungs completely stopped functioning. I was physically paralyzed by a terror so absolute it completely fractured my perception of reality. I slowly shifted my eyes away from the digital screen. I stared straight ahead at the heavy metal motel door. I saw the thick steel deadbolt locked securely into place. I was trapped in a completely soundproof concrete cage. I slowly turned my rigid neck toward the tiny bathroom. The rusted metal hinges of the thin wooden door began to creak. The sound was agonizingly slow, a high-pitched whine scraping against the deafening quiet. The door swung wide open into the dim room. Peering back at me from the absolute pitch-black darkness of the bathroom was a face. It was illuminated only by the faint, flickering neon light filtering through the window blinds. Only the left half of its face was visible in the heavy shadows. Its dark eye was entirely unblinking, stretched violently wide open, completely devoid of any white sclera. It stood completely still in the dark, silently observing my crushing despair. Then, the bottom half of its face violently shifted. The jaw unhinged with a wet, sickening pop that echoed off the cheap floral wallpaper. It dropped exactly an inch too low. It exposed rows of incredibly sharp, crowded teeth meant for tearing dense muscle from bone. Its elongated, pale gray fingers slowly curled around the edge of the bathroom doorframe. The heavy wood audibly splintered and cracked under the immense pressure of its unnatural grip. The creature stared directly into my terrified eyes. In a flawlessly synthesized, hollow mimicry of my own panicked voice, it finally spoke. "We have to leave the house. Right now. Honey." The phone slipped from my paralyzed fingers and hit the carpet with a dull thud. The tiny speaker continued to project the muffled screams of my wife locked miles away. The heavy, dead air in the motel room violently shattered. The sickening, wet crunch of an impossible spine bending backward filled the dark space as it lunged.